You know, this concept of fractal localism that I've talked about on the podcast, where it's like the closer you get to your house, the more that you are kind of a socialist, right? So like in my home, I'm a communist. Everybody shares everything. You know, you get into my in-laws and my extended family, then you're more of a socialist. And then as you get further and further out, you want less shared, and you want more of like, hey, we're going to decide that you have less control over me and I have less control over you. But it seems as though the pressure of society almost always moves towards a centralization. Is that right? Or is that just my opinion? Because it seems like over time, you always move towards a stronger center of government where you can be further and further away from the home and have more and more control over what's going on inside of my home.
I think so. I just based on my knowledge and observations, yes. I would hint to a moment in history where centralization was torn down and it created great conflict, and that would be the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a tearing down of central authority, and that absence of central authority created a great amount of violence that extended for a long period of time. Not a lot of people know this, and I will get into this in my podcast because it affects American history. But the French Revolution was not King Louis, revolutionaries, and then Napoleon. It was King Louis, and then all these other people switched hands, and then it was Napoleon. And all those people switching hands was because there was a total lack of central government.
Ben Anderson, who's somebody that we both know, he's the executive producer on this podcast. He has thrown forward his Peter Thiel paradox, that he believes that Trump is going to be reelected and he will be the last American president in the current society that we're living in, that the kickback from that will be so strong that the next presidential election won't look like the same United States that we're in. As you hear this idea, what's your reaction?
I would react by saying it's very well possible. There is currently a movement underway to remove the Electoral College. And if Donald Trump were to be reelected, I think that the Electoral College would be threatened. That institution would definitely be threatened. Beyond that, though, I'm not sure what else I could see that necessarily changes. I do think we are at risk. I do think that we are at risk, Vance, for criminally investigating every single president that comes up after Donald Trump because of the amount of effort and attention that went into this last impeachment. I think that if Joe Biden is elected, you may see that whole Ukraine thing come up with Republicans and them try to start the same thing. So we may get into this cycle of criminally investigating U.S. presidents because of the fervor that came out of the 2016 election.
Yeah, and there's this weird power. Like I've always said, if you don't like the direction that the opposition is going in, the other side's presidential candidate or their winner or whatever, then the goal should not be get your guy in. It should be lower the amount of power that office holds. So that way you don't have to fight to the death over it. But the thing that you're describing about then using the courts to fight over the presidential elections, this only further increases the centralization of power, but also then making everything a zero-sum fight where you're litigating the last election as opposed to figuring out, what do we need to do to have the proper governance so that human beings can flourish? And however you think they should flourish, fine. Let's argue with that over the laws that we create and how it gets enacted. But we're just putting way, way, way too much power into individual components of the government.
Absolutely. And I'll take it a step further. After the first presidential debate, I went on social media, which I don't do often, and I posed a question, very simple question to everybody after that debate. Is anybody ready to have a conversation about limited government? And it was interesting. I didn't get as much of a response as I thought I would, but that was my takeaway from all this. If you're watching these debates and you're watching our federal government do things and you have this sense of hopelessness, why do you feel that way? Is it because you've given too much authority to the central government to dictate your life and create that hopelessness? That's what I think. And when I was in college, I didn't say this often, but I said it a few times. I said to people, one political party in this country has been mostly responsible for building up the institution of federal government. At some point, there's going to be somebody that comes in and takes that huge federal government and weaponizes it against the ideology of the people who created it. And that's what I think we have right now in Donald Trump. When Donald Trump was elected, I looked at my wife and said, the opposition is going to have a terrible time dealing with him. They're not going to know what to do because he's going to weaponize the federal government against their ideology. So now I think is a great time for everybody to have a conversation about limited government. Because to your point, we may have the Supreme Court deciding the next 3 or 4 elections. Who knows?
Yeah. So in my neighborhood association, somebody sent an email out about signs. There was like some argument about whether or not you could put up political signs, and it doesn't really matter the details. But the email that was written that the entire neighborhood saw, you could strip out whether they were talking about the left or the right, and it would make no difference. Both sides feel like the other side is being a bully and that you're having a fight over, and this was a literal quote, the soul of the nation. And when you start thinking about that, it's like, wait a second, really the only soul that I can control is mine. And then outside of that, my family, like what can I contribute to my family? And the further that you get out into what is the soul of something, you start getting into some weird territory where people start being able to be weaponized. Their ideology, their fervor about the importance of this one election or this one judge or this one situation, it ultimately can be used to whip up a mob and to get people to do things that they never would have done had they just been focused on what can I control and what should I be doing for myself and my family.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I've taken a very very passive approach to this election because I don't want to get caught up in all the emotion that's being generated. I'm seeing all the emotion that is being generated and seeing it as, I hate to say it, but a total waste of time. We are unable right now to talk about actual issues going on in this country. For the first time, I know very little about both candidates' status or standing on foreign policy.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.